Chinonso's friends always said he was too trusting, but he never believed them. He kept telling himself that people meant well, especially when they sounded calm and gentle. That changed the day he met Amaka. He saw her for the first time at a small eatery in Enugu. She sat alone, stirring her drink slowly like she was lost in her own thoughts. Something about her quietness pulled him closer. She wasn't forcing attention, she wasn't loud, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just sat there like she carried stories that nobody had heard before. When their eyes met, she smiled in a way that felt warm at first, like she already knew him. Chinonso greeted her, and she replied softly. Her voice had this sweetness that wrapped around him before he even knew what was happening. They ended up talking for hours, laughing about little things and sharing jokes that made strangers look at them. She told him she was from IMO, that she lived with her cousin, and that life had been rough for her. Everything she said sounded honest. But it was the moment she leaned in and whispered that changed everything. She said her ex was the reason she didn't trust people. She said he had ruined her peace. She said she had suffered because of him. The way she said it made Chinonso feel like she had been wounded in a way he wanted to fix. He felt this sudden need to protect her, to show her she deserved better. She didn't cry, but her eyes softened in a way that made him believe every word without asking questions. She held his gaze like she wanted him to promise he wouldn't become another person who broke her heart. From that night, they started talking every day. Amaka always sounded grateful whenever he checked on her. She spoke with gentleness, with a smile in her voice that made him feel like he had found someone who truly saw him. Whenever he asked about her past, she shrugged it off, saying it was too painful to explain in detail. She repeated that her ex was the reason she became quiet and withdrawn. She painted herself as someone who only needed care, someone who had been misunderstood. The more she spoke, the more she shaped herself as the victim of an unseen tormentor. Chinonso didn't know why it affected him so deeply. He told himself he was only trying to be supportive, but truthfully, the way she told her stories made him feel chosen. She made him feel special, like he was the one person she let into her guarded world. Soon, she started depending on him for everything. If he didn't call early enough, she asked why. If he missed her messages, she reminded him that she didn't want to feel abandoned like her ex made her feel. She always found a gentle way to make him feel responsible for her emotions. At first, he took it as affection. He believed she was simply afraid of being hurt again. But there was something else he didn't notice. Each time she blamed her ex, her eyes carried a glint he couldn't explain. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was something sharper, something that didn't match her fragile stories. Sometimes, when she laughed, it sounded too quick, like she switched moods without warning. Sometimes she watched him with this calmness that made his chest tighten, though he didn't understand why. There were moments when she became too sweet, too affectionate, almost like she was performing the version of herself she wanted him to see. She would tell him how different he was from every man she had met, how safe she felt with him, how she prayed for someone like him. The way she said it made his heart swell. He didn't know that the more she praised him, the more she pulled him deeper. Her cousin Chidima tried to warn him once. She called him aside after he dropped Amaka at their gate and asked him quietly if everything was fine between them. Chinonso smiled and told her they were doing well. But Chidima didn't smile back. She held her arms across her chest like she was hiding something. She started to speak, then changed her mind and shook her head. That night, Chinonso asked Amaka what Chidima meant, and her reaction was unexpected. She became silent, then told him that Chidima was jealous of her happiness. She said her cousin had always tried to ruin her relationships. She sounded so hurt that Chinonso dropped the topic immediately. He didn't want to stress her. He didn't want to be the reason she remembered her past. But the truth was beginning to slip through the cracks. The first real sign came quietly. One evening, Chinonso went to surprise her without calling first. He expected her to be happy. Instead, she opened the door with eyes that widened too quickly. Behind her, the room was in a mess. She blocked the entrance like she didn't want him to see something. She forced a laugh and told him she wasn't feeling well. She tried to smile, but her hands were shaking slightly. He didn't ask questions because she looked like she would break if he pushed. She held his hand and told him she only needed peace. She repeated that her ex never gave her peace. She said she wanted him to be different. Again, she used sweetness to cover what didn't make sense. That night, while he walked home, something in his chest felt heavy. For the first time, he wondered what exactly happened between her and her ex. For the first time, he wondered if she had told him everything. But every time doubt tried to rise, the memory of her soft voice pushed it down. He kept telling himself she had suffered. He kept telling himself he understood her. What he didn't know was that the real story was still hiding. And the girl who kept saying her ex was the problem had secrets that were slowly shaping his life in ways he had not yet seen. And without realizing it, Chinonso was already too deep to pull back. Chinonso couldn't sleep that night. He kept replaying Amaka's words in his head, trying to understand why every time she mentioned her ex, her voice was soft but carried this weight that pressed on his chest. He told himself it was empathy. He told himself it was care. But deep inside, there was this unease he couldn't explain. Something about the way she framed her past made him feel like he was stepping into a story someone else had written, and she had handed him the pen. The next morning, he found himself walking through the streets of Enugu, not paying attention to the people passing by, not noticing the vendors shouting or the smell of roasted yam in the air. His mind was tangled with thoughts of Amaka. He remembered how her fingers had lingered in his, how her laughter had carried a tinge of sadness that almost sounded like longing. He had seen it in her eyes. She wanted him to fix what her ex had broken. He wanted to, he really did. He met her later at the small cafe they had begun to call their spot. She was already there, stirring her tea slowly, her gaze distant. When she noticed him, she smiled in that same way that made his chest tighten. He walked over and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, but Chinonso could feel it stretching too far, like something unspoken was hovering between them. Then she spoke. She told him that she had been thinking a lot about her past, about how people had let her down. She said she had realized that men often said one thing but did another. Her ex had been a lesson, she said, though she didn't go into details. She leaned forward and placed her hand lightly on his. Her fingers brushed his, just enough to make his skin tingle. She said softly, "I need someone who understands me, someone who sees me." He nodded, not fully realizing that her words were weaving a thread around him, binding him without him noticing. Days passed, and Amaka's influence over him grew. She sent messages at all hours, each one carefully crafted to tug at his emotions. Sometimes it was gratitude, sometimes longing, sometimes sadness. Chinonso found himself reading her words over and over, memorizing every sentence, every phrase. When she said her ex was the problem, he believed it entirely. She never spoke about herself doing anything wrong. She painted a picture of perfect vulnerability, and he fell into it. Her cousin Chidima remained a quiet shadow in the background. She watched Chinonso with a sharpness that he couldn't interpret. There was something protective about the way she followed his interactions with Amaka, but she never interfered openly. Chinonso thought it was indifference at first. Then one afternoon, Chidima cornered him while he was leaving Amaka's house. She asked gently if he was really happy, if he felt something wasn't right. He smiled and said yes. Chidima didn't push further, just gave him a look that made him feel slightly uneasy and walked away. He tried to shake the feeling off, thinking it was jealousy or overprotectiveness. Amaka's stories became more elaborate. She spoke of nights spent crying, of promises broken, of loneliness so deep that only someone truly caring could reach her. Chinonso didn't realize that every story subtly shifted her in his eyes, making her the only person he could see in her way. He didn't notice the way she sometimes contradicted herself, casually mentioning a date or a friend he had never heard of, yet brushing it off with a smile as if it didn't matter. Her past was like a puzzle, and she was carefully choosing which pieces he was allowed to see. Then the subtle control started. She began to need him to respond immediately to her texts, to be present whenever she called. If he couldn't, she would lightly guilt him, always phrasing it as concern or fear of being hurt again. Chinonso found himself apologizing for small things he didn't even think were wrong. He felt responsible for her emotions, for her sense of security, for the happiness she claimed she had lost because of her ex. Every word she spoke laid another piece of responsibility on him. One evening, she invited him to her cousin's small apartment, saying she wanted to show him something special. When he arrived, the apartment seemed almost empty, save for a few small decorations and books stacked neatly. She guided him into a corner of the room where a small photo frame stood, hidden behind some papers. It was a picture of her with another man, someone Chinonso didn't recognize. She told him quickly that it was her ex, and that he had hurt her more than she could ever say. Her eyes glistened, her voice trembled just enough. Chinonso felt his heart squeeze. He didn't question it. He didn't need to. He believed her entirely. From that day, every encounter became a delicate dance. She would smile, cry, tease, and manipulate subtly, all while wrapping him in the illusion that he was her savior. He began to miss sleep thinking of her. He began to plan his day around her moods. He began to feel like he couldn't breathe properly unless he knew she was okay. Her ex had created a vacuum in her life, she said, and Chinonso was there to fill it. He didn't see that she was slowly learning how to shape him, how to bend him, how to test his boundaries without ever seeming cruel. Her influence even touched his friends. If he mentioned spending time with them, she would text later, quietly, almost innocently, asking if he really wanted to leave her alone. Chinonso brushed it off at first, thinking she was simply insecure. He thought he was helping her heal. He didn't realize that she had begun to occupy not just his heart, but the space around him, the decisions he made, and the way he saw the world. Then one night, things changed subtly. He found himself walking back from her house under a heavy rain. She had asked him to come, said she needed company. When he arrived, she looked different, almost calculating. She smiled and said it had been a long day, that she was tired, that she didn't want to be alone. Her gaze lingered too long, and her hand reached for his with an urgency that wasn't there before. He felt himself obeying her pull, staying longer than he should have. She said softly, almost in a whisper, "I don't want anyone else to ever hurt me again." He nodded, feeling like the one person who could protect her. Chinonso didn't notice that the real danger was not her past, not her ex, but the way she was quietly teaching him to place her above everything else, to put her first in all things, even when it began to cost him pieces of himself. She was weaving her story around him, and he was following willingly, unable to see how completely she was drawing him into her carefully constructed world. The next morning, he woke with a heavy feeling he couldn't name. The sun was bright outside, but he felt a shadow inside him, like something had shifted overnight. Amaka's words echoed in his mind, her gentle warnings about men, her stories about her ex. He told himself it was just empathy. He told himself it was care. Yet beneath it all, a faint voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, the problem was not entirely her ex. And he didn't yet know that the girl who claimed her ex was the problem had already begun to change his life in ways he could not imagine, ways that were quietly, dangerously permanent. Chinonso tried to shake the heaviness from his chest, but the feeling didn't fade. He went about his morning routine mechanically, washing his face, brushing his teeth, walking past the neighbors without really seeing them. His mind kept replaying the moments with Amaka, how her soft words could make his heart leap and then sink all in the same breath. There was something magnetic about her, something that made him forget the world outside, even as the city of Enugu moved around him with all its noises and colors. When he finally texted her, she replied almost immediately. "I missed you," she typed, and he could feel the warmth in the words, as though the phone itself carried her presence. He didn't know why, but he felt a sudden surge of need to go to her, to see her, to make sure she was okay. By the time he arrived at her cousin's apartment, she was sitting on the small couch, legs tucked under her, reading a book. The faint smell of her perfume filled the space, sweet but understated, like she wanted him to notice without thinking too hard. She looked up and smiled, but this time it was different. Her eyes held something sharp, almost like a test. She asked casually how his day had been, but there was a subtle edge in her tone. Chinonso hesitated, wondering if he had done something wrong. She saw him pause and laughed softly, a sound that could have been comforting but carried an invisible weight. She leaned forward, and the moment her fingers brushed his, he felt a shiver run through him. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "I don't like being alone when I feel like this." It wasn't the first time she had said it, but this time, he noticed the way her words drew him in, the way they subtly placed him in a position of responsibility. He didn't question it. He didn't want to. He felt needed, wanted, like someone trusted him completely for the first time in a way that made him dizzy with emotion. But there was a whisper in the back of his mind, faint and hesitant, wondering if her dependence was too much, if it was more than he could give without losing himself. He ignored it. As the days turned into weeks, Amaka's hold on him tightened. She began to weave herself into every aspect of his life, sometimes openly, sometimes subtly. She asked him to come to the market with her, to help her pick out things for her cousin's small home. She wanted him to meet her friends, to be part of her routines. At first, it felt natural. Chinonso felt like he was stepping into her world, filling the gaps that her past had left behind. But gradually, the lines blurred. He started to notice that she would remind him constantly of her ex, not in bitterness, not in anger, but in carefully placed stories that made him feel like he alone could prevent her from ever being hurt again. One evening, while they sat on the small balcony of her cousin's apartment, she told him about a night her ex had left her in the rain. She described the cold, the loneliness, the feeling of betrayal. Her words were vivid, almost cinematic, and Chinonso could feel himself leaning closer, absorbing every detail as if they were his own memories. She placed her hand over his, squeezing it lightly, and whispered that she had never felt safe with anyone until him. He nodded, swallowing hard, feeling a mixture of pride and fear. He was happy she trusted him, but he couldn't shake the faint unease growing inside him. The subtle manipulations continued. She began to test him in small ways. She would tell him stories about friends or people in her life, and when he offered advice or opinions, she would nod, seeming satisfied. But then later she would ask again, as if she needed confirmation that he understood her completely. Chinonso didn't realize it, but she was mapping out his responses, his limits, the ways he could be influenced without realizing. Every word he spoke, every reaction he had, she noted and adapted to. Her affection was intoxicating. She would call him late at night, just to hear his voice, to feel his presence through the words on the other end of the line. She told him she couldn't sleep without knowing he was there, even if only on the phone. Chinonso would lie awake, feeling the weight of her dependency, and though he knew it might not be healthy, he couldn't bring himself to pull away. There was a sense of purpose in it, a feeling that he was protecting someone who had been broken, someone who needed him in a way no one else could provide. Then came the moments that confused him the most. Sometimes, Amaka would laugh in ways that felt too deliberate, almost calculated. Other times, she would seem distant, her eyes drifting past him, as though she were considering another plan. He tried to reconcile these moods with her stories of pain and loss, telling himself that it was trauma, that she needed him to stay patient and gentle. He didn't see that she was carefully shaping him, testing the edges of his patience and affection, seeing how far she could stretch him before he broke. Her influence even reached his work life. She would call him while he was at the office, asking seemingly innocent questions about his day, but when he didn't respond fast enough, she would send messages hinting at worry or disappointment. Chinonso found himself checking his phone constantly, even during meetings, feeling a rush of guilt if he hadn't responded immediately. She had become a constant presence, a shadow that followed him everywhere, wrapped in sweetness and vulnerability. One afternoon, Chinonso went to visit a friend who had recently returned from Lagos. As they talked about work, travel, and old times, Chinonso's mind kept drifting to Amaka. His friend noticed the distraction and asked what was wrong. Chinonso tried to laugh it off, saying it was nothing, just a girl. But his friend, more perceptive than he realized, leaned back and said carefully that he hoped Chinonso wasn't losing himself over her. Chinonso smiled, shaking his head, but a flicker of doubt passed through him. He didn't voice it, didn't want to think it, because the thought of questioning Amaka felt like betrayal. The tipping point came subtly, like a slow current pulling him under. One night, she asked him to come over, saying she couldn't sleep and needed comfort. He arrived to find her sitting in the dim glow of a single lamp, her hair falling over her face, her posture small but deliberate. She told him stories of her ex again, stories so vivid and detailed that Chinonso felt his chest tighten with anger for someone he had never met. She leaned against him, whispered that she had never felt safe, that she needed him to be different, that he was the only one who could protect her. And Chinonso believed her entirely. He held her close, feeling the warmth of her body, the softness of her voice, the pull of her carefully constructed vulnerability. He didn't see the manipulation, didn't see the patterns, didn't realize how deeply she was embedding herself into his heart, mind, and life. Every word, every gesture, every story she told was a thread, and he was already tangled in them without knowing it. By the time he left her apartment that night, he felt drained but exhilarated, like he had been through a storm and emerged closer to someone he was supposed to protect. He didn't notice the way she watched him leave, her eyes calm but sharp, as if measuring his every step, every decision, every heartbeat. She had taught him to care, to respond, to prioritize her above all else, and he didn't yet realize that the lessons were shaping his world in ways he could never undo. And in the quiet hours after he walked home, Chinonso felt a strange mixture of warmth and unease. He told himself he was helping her heal, that he was there for her, that he was making a difference. But deep down, a faint voice whispered, almost like a warning. Sometimes the girl who says her ex was the problem is not the one you should trust completely, and the danger often comes hidden in sweetness. The line between love and entanglement had blurred, and Chinonso didn't yet know that he was already caught, drawn into a story carefully constructed to pull him further than he could imagine. The girl who claimed her ex was the problem was quietly reshaping everything around her, and Chinonso, head over heels and blinded by care, hadn't even noticed the trap closing. Chinonso woke before sunrise that morning, his mind tangled with thoughts of Amaka. Even in sleep, he dreamt of her, her soft smile, the way her fingers grazed his hand, the subtle pull of her presence that made him feel alive and anxious at the same time. He got dressed quickly, barely eating breakfast, telling himself he had to see her. The world outside his small room seemed muted, colors duller, sounds quieter, as if everything around him was waiting for what was about to unfold with Amaka. When he reached her cousin's apartment, she was sitting by the window, sunlight streaming across her face, her hair cascading over her shoulders. She looked up when he knocked, her eyes lighting up in a way that made him forget every thought he had carried on the way there. She welcomed him in, and for a moment, he thought it was just another ordinary visit. But from the moment he stepped inside, the air changed. There was a quiet tension he couldn't identify, a subtle intensity in the way she moved, the way she smiled, the way she spoke. She asked him to sit beside her on the small couch, and as he did, she leaned close, speaking in that low, sweet voice he had come to crave. She told him stories again, not about her ex this time, but about her fears, her desires, her dreams. Every word was carefully chosen, drawing him in further, making him feel like he was the only person who could understand the complexities of her life. She asked questions that seemed casual, but each one was a test, a way to see how he would respond, how much he cared, how far he would go to prove he was different from the man she claimed had hurt her before. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, but Chinonso didn't notice. He was trapped in her world, caught in the gravity of her presence. She spoke about loyalty, about trust, about how much she had suffered, and how much she longed for someone who would never leave her like her ex had. Her words were soft but insistent, wrapping around him like a rope he willingly let tighten. He found himself promising things he didn't even know he could keep, reassuring her endlessly, even though he was beginning to feel fragments of doubt he couldn't place. Amaka's influence extended into his thoughts, his habits, his daily life. She called at precise moments, often just when he thought he could have a free minute to himself. She would text, "I was just thinking about you," and the simple words would make him drop everything to respond. She would ask about his day with gentle concern, and if he hesitated, she would subtly imply worry, guilt, or disappointment. Chinonso, who had never felt responsible for anyone in this way before, was drawn deeper, feeling needed, wanted, like he had finally found someone who made his existence matter. Her manipulation was artful. She blended vulnerability with a quiet dominance, making him believe he was the protector, the savior, the one person who could ensure she never felt the pain her ex had caused. And Chinonso believed it completely. He didn't notice that her calm eyes, the softness in her tone, and the careful timing of her words were all tools, shaping him, bending him, subtly eroding the boundaries he once had. One night, she asked him to come over after work. When he arrived, the apartment was dimly lit with candles. The room smelled faintly of vanilla, the air thick with an almost tangible sense of intimacy. She told him she had been thinking about what it meant to be hurt and healed, to be broken and loved again. Her voice was low, almost hypnotic, drawing him closer, making him forget the hours he had spent walking, thinking, breathing. She leaned against him, whispered that she needed him to stay, that she couldn't face the night alone. He held her, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across his chest, not yet aware that it was exactly the trap she intended. The following days were even more intense. She began involving him in the smallest decisions, asking his opinion on matters that shouldn't have mattered. What to cook, what to buy, how to arrange her cousin's small apartment. She praised him constantly, framing his words as wisdom, his actions as proof of his unique kindness. Chinonso, addicted to the validation and the sense of purpose, didn't see how he was being slowly consumed by her presence. Then came a subtle escalation. She started hinting at jealousy, saying casually that she had noticed other women looking at him, that she feared being replaced, that no one else could understand her as he did. Each comment was delivered softly, like a confession, but each one planted a seed in his mind. He found himself altering his behavior, avoiding friends, thinking twice about where he went or who he spoke to, all to preserve the fragile world she had created. One evening, Chinonso's best friend tried to intervene. He noticed the change in Chinonso, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he jumped at his phone, the obsessive need to check messages from Amaka. He asked cautiously if everything was okay, if he felt controlled, if he was being used. Chinonso laughed nervously, insisting that he was just being attentive, that Amaka had been through so much and needed someone who cared. The friend's warning fell flat, drowned by the flood of emotions Chinonso felt for Amaka, emotions that now dominated every corner of his life. Amaka's stories of her ex became more elaborate and frequent. She described betrayals, small injustices, nights spent crying, moments of fear she had never shared with anyone. Chinonso, wrapped in the illusion of being her savior, absorbed every detail, replaying them in his mind, building a protective shield around her. He didn't see the pattern, the subtle shift from sadness to control, the way she used her past as a tool to shape his actions, his choices, his very thoughts. Then came the test that changed everything. She asked him to stay over for a week, saying she had been lonely, anxious, and needed his presence constantly. Chinonso, already ensnared, agreed without hesitation. The week became a blur of constant attention, of late-night conversations, of her whispering fears and desires that seemed innocent but were designed to tie him tighter to her world. He barely ate on time, barely slept properly, barely spoke to anyone outside her. His life outside her had begun to vanish, replaced entirely by the world she controlled. By the 7th day, Chinonso realized something was wrong. He felt trapped, yet unable to pull away. He wanted to step back, but every time he considered it, her soft voice haunted him, reminding him of how much she had suffered, how much she depended on him, how he was the only person who could ensure she would never feel pain again. The thought of leaving her, even briefly, now felt unbearable. He didn't yet see that this was exactly the point. Amaka's gaze remained calm, unwavering, always calculating. She had perfected the balance of vulnerability and control, of charm and subtle threat, of affection and manipulation. Chinonso, believing himself the protector, had become deeply ensnared, unable to recognize the danger that had been growing quietly around him from the very beginning. And as the days turned into weeks, the truth became clear in ways Chinonso couldn't yet articulate. The girl who kept saying her ex was the problem was not simply broken, not simply in need of care. She was a force, carefully shaping him, guiding him, and wrapping his life around her presence. The lines between love, trust, and control had blurred, and Chinonso, lost in his devotion, was already caught in a world he didn't yet understand. He was deeply, irrevocably entangled. And the final lesson, the one he could not yet see, was about to reveal itself in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the danger hidden behind a gentle smile. Thank you for following this story all the way through. If you felt the suspense, the twists, and the tension as Chinonso navigated the world Amaka created, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next gripping tale. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments and join our growing global community of story lovers. Every message you leave keeps these stories alive and lets us bring more drama, suspense, and unforgettable moments straight to your screen.